Hey folks, welcome to Toronto Data Workshop. My name is Rohan Alexander. I'm an assistant professor in information and statistics at the University of Toronto. Today's event is actually being co-hosted with Maryclare Griffin.
So I'm Maryclare Griffin. I'm very excited that Rohan invited me to co-host this with him. I'm an assistant professor in math and statistics at UMass Amherst. And usually I do high dimensional data analysis and time series spatial data, but I've also ended up talking about ethics in various parts of my research life. So yeah, I'm very excited to hear what Todd has to say.
Yeah, and so as Maryclare mentioned, our guest is Todd Feathers. He's a freelance journalist who focuses on artificial intelligence, surveillance, and the other sort of related technologies that shape our world. He's written in a whole bunch of different publications that we've probably all heard of, including Vice, OneZero, the Wall Street Journal, and a bunch of others. But he's joining us today to talk about an article that was published in the Markup at the start of this month, so on 2 March. The article is called "Major Universities Are Using Race as a High Impact Predictor of Student Success." I'll put a link into the chat, and also for those of you watching later on YouTube, I'll add it into the YouTube description. The plan is that Todd will talk through his article for 10 or 15 minutes, and then Maryclare and I will ask him a few questions, and we'll moderate an audience question period as well. Please feel free to add comments and questions into the chat as we go, and we'll pick them up as they're relevant. And then we'll also invite folks at the end as well to ask their questions themselves. And just a friendly reminder that we're recording today's presentation, but we don't record the text chat. So if you, so feel free to add things into there that you're more comfortable. So Todd, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Rohan. A special thank you to Maryclare, who, as you'll see if you read the article, is also quoted in there and was very helpful to me as I was writing it. Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, I'm a little bit scared talking to a bunch of data scientists. I never got past pre-calculus in high school, although I have learned a lot about artificial intelligence since. But please don't ask me any questions that aren't, division or subtraction or anything like that. Yeah, so the article, we set out to kind of answer one specific question, which is that if predictive analytics are being used in higher education to assign student risk scores, what effect does that have on students who have been historically marginalized, especially since this data, this is historic data from universities that's being used to predict the future, essentially. So about 550 schools use EAB's Navigate software. It does a bunch of things, but one of the main selling points for it is that it assigns each student a risk score based on the likelihood that they will graduate or not within their selected major at that time. There are a couple different companies that do this, but we focused on EAB because it's one of the largest, and we were able to actually get some data and interesting documents related to that. And these risk scores are presented as high, medium, and low. They're also color-coded in some cases, red, yellow, and green. And they're one of the first things that an advisor or a faculty member or anybody with access to this data is going to see when they look up a student. So we submitted public records requests to, I think it ended up being almost 36 universities, and got documents back from 5 of them that laid out the variables that EAB's models were incorporating for those specific schools. One of the schools didn't use race at all. That was Kansas State University. Interestingly, it was the only school that did incorporate any variable related to a student's income. In that case, it was the median income from the student's home zip code. 4 schools did incorporate race. 2 of them, I'm sorry, used it as what EAB calls a high impact predictor. And the way the company explains that is that it's a variable that accounts for more than 5% of the variance across students who have completed the same level of credits, and that it will either have a big effect on a small number of students or a moderate effect on a large number of students. We then got data from 4 other schools that showed that in some cases, Black students, minority students, but Black students in particular, were being assigned high risk scores at disproportionate rates to their white peers. At UMass Amherst, where Maryclare is, if I remember the numbers correctly, which I will not, Black women were 2.8 times more likely to be high risk than white women, and Black men were 3.9 times more likely to be high risk than white men. that was one of the higher rates of disparity, but they were all, at least double the rate of white peers of the schools we looked at. And so then the big question is, how are schools using this data? What's it designed to do, and is it causing anybody harm? And what we found is that EAB markets its service as a way for schools to use limited advising resources, limited resources in general, especially in a time of state austerity, to make big picture solutions. Georgia State is the school that's held up as the example of how to do this in a lot of cases. And what they've done is developed a kind of nation or industry leading student success and retention center. They've improved their graduation rates dramatically. I think they offered 83%, they're awarded 83% more degrees from the year that they started doing this until last year. And the biggest gains have been among Black students, Latinx students, and Pell Grant recipients, which is obviously populations that we want to be boosting in higher education. But at the schools that we examined and the folks that we talked to, it seems like what's happening more often than not is that these risk scores are being used to make decisions about individual students, or to encourage students to pursue classes or majors in which the algorithms deem them to be less risky. It's a lot more expensive to recruit students than it is to retain students. So there's a financial pressure on schools to make sure the students stay. And it seems like in some cases that includes encouraging students to switch into less risky majors. And if Black students and Latinx students are being deemed higher risk at greater rates than white students, it's just perpetuating, and in some cases it seems like exacerbating, the historical biases that have kept students out of STEM fields in particular in the past. It's kind of the high level summary, but don't know if anything's unclear there. If you guys have any questions just about the basics of the story.
No, that was great. Maryclare, did you want to start off? Or?
Sure. Yeah, I can start with my first question for you, and we can alternate. So probably a good question to start with is, I was curious. So when I started talking to people about this, even before your article came out, and we knew that this was going on, but when I was kind of suspicious that it was happening, I would go to my colleagues and be like, I think this might be using race. I'm worried about it. I don't know what it's doing. And something that I was surprised to encounter pretty often was that people would be hard to convince with respect to the idea that maybe this is a bad thing. So I talked to a lot of people who are like, oh, well, if we're just going to use it to direct more resources to students, what's the harm? And so I'm just curious if you've also encountered that communication challenge with people, and if there have been ways that you've been able to explain it effectively.
Yes, so I think it's a good question. It's not easy to answer. I talked to a number of experts, algorithmic experts in education for this piece, who said, versions of, this is a really good example of how predictive analytics can be used either for good or for evil. And it's not really about the technology so much. It's not even necessarily about the fact that race is incorporated, because as I think we might talk about a little bit later, there are many ways that an algorithm can pick up on race, even if that is not specifically the variable. The problem is that people don't know that this is happening. I didn't talk to anybody outside of EAB who knew how these algorithms were calculating the risk scores, who had a good idea of which variables at their school were high impact predictors and which weren't, and that those were administrators. It's even less true for people who are actually dealing with students. So I think the point to emphasize is that, and I can't say that I've convinced anybody in my communication, so I'm not going to have any great strategies, but the point that convinces me and that I find most compelling is that you can't just put a technology out there, say it's going to do this out of the box and not explain how it works, and expect people to make all the contextual decisions that they need to deploy it properly. And so if we're going to be doing this, everybody has to know how it works. And that's a pretty challenging prospect when it comes to, people like me who don't work in this field and don't do math.
Lorena, did you want to ask you a question? And maybe just a brief bio so that Todd knows who he's talking to.
Yes, I'm a Master of Information student, both in policy and in data science. And as a woman of color and an immigrant, I know I'm always affected by these automated things. I just know that. But how did you hear about this specific software? And because they always seem to be hidden from everyone at all times, how can we familiarize ourselves with them, or where to look for them and when they might be used?
Yeah, so I heard about this by chance. I was talking to a source of mine at a university about an entirely different story. And the person just mentioned, because I write a lot about ed tech, that there were some folks in the advising department in his school who were kind of concerned about this company EAB, and that they didn't really understand why some of the students they were seeing were getting the risk scores that they were. And so, I mean, frankly, whenever I hear the word risk score, it raises a red flag, and I want to look into it a little bit more. In terms of finding out whether schools are using it and how it's being used, in this case, there are three main companies. EAB is one, Civitas is another, and then until recently, there was Hobson's, which has a product called Starfish. But EAB, I found out, I think this was actually just before the article was published, bought Hobson's Starfish. So it now, I'm not sure exactly if they're just taking their clients and moving them onto the EAB program, or exactly what they're doing. But those are the three big players. So you can Google that. The companies a lot of the times very prominently advertise where their client schools are. Another thing, if you really want to get into the public records world, is you can ask schools for privacy impact assessments, or data dictionaries for various kinds of programs. It takes a long time, and it's not very efficient. And unless you want to write an article about it, it's maybe not the best step. But yeah, I'm not sure if that really answers it.
Rohan, I was going to let you go next if you would like to go next with one of your questions.
Oh no, Lorena stole what I was going to say. So.
Oh. Well, I will just add on to Todd's answer briefly as someone from the university side of it, because I can also contribute to answering your question. Is I only found out through advisor training. So I had to take a training class to use the software, because we in our department, all faculty advise 10 students or something like that, which is pretty crazy. I don't feel like I'm very good at helping students navigate the math major, but it was the same, like, it was just coincidence. Like, I saw this risk score and I was like, what is that? And I couldn't find anything except for like a post that Todd had made on a message board looking for information about Navigate. I could not find out anything about how this algorithm worked or what these scores were based on. So yeah, anyway, now I can, I guess, ask the next question I had on my list. And actually this sort of gets, so I know you just started talking about this at the end, Todd, but I was curious if you could talk more about the other uses of algorithms like this that you see coming up. So I know you kind of alluded to that at the end of the article, talking about concern that these could end up used in like admissions. And yeah, so sort of what you've seen related to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really something that I didn't get into as much as I would have liked to in the piece, and is definitely something I'm going to be working on more in the future. But there's the incentive for schools to use this to decide how best to retain the students they have, but there's even more incentive to make sure that they're choosing the right students from the beginning, getting the students that will benefit the school most, and where the school will benefit those students most. And that's another field that's ripe for predictive analytics. If you look at any kind of ed tech conference, you're going to find one or two companies that are suggesting they can do variations on this. The ones that I know are out there, and I'm sorry I can't remember any specific names right now, they're more focused, as far as I can tell right now, on saying use this tool to decide where to target your recruiting. We see a lot of students from this area who want to go to your area, or historically have good success with this kind of students. And depending on the variables and the kind of education that goes into that, I think that's ripe for the same kinds of problems that this is. It would be a real shame if we're not even giving students of color, the chance to get into school, much less kind of starting this narrative that they are already at risk once they get there. And then I think it's also worth mentioning that, this is happening on the other side of it. I don't know if you folks have followed the higher view news, but, algorithms are being used to screen people out of jobs. So, that there's a potential to use that in higher education admissions as well, when you're doing interviews. And my personal belief is that whenever you can propose a technology solution in the ed tech industry and say it's cheaper and faster and, eliminates bias, you're going to find a customer or two, because a lot of folks are just not, educated about some of the fairness issues.
How long does it take you to gather the data for this? How long has this sort of piece been in the work?
Yeah, so I think I started on this in November of last year. And I could talk at length about public records. It's kind of my nerdy passion and hobby. But so I'm not actually familiar at all with the public records law in Canada. So this will potentially not be very helpful to many of you in Toronto. But here in the US, any public institution, the knowledge they have, the documents they have, they should belong to the public. We have a right to ask for them and request them and view them. There are a lot of exemptions to that, and it becomes a very complicated legal process of trying to get it a lot of times, but you can get stuff. And so, I'd sent out a series of requests to about a dozen universities when I first heard about this company, asking for a pretty broad category of documents, any kind of validation studies or, differential impact analyses for these algorithms, contracts, things like that, any kind of reports that you'd be prepared saying, this is how accurate our algorithm is. And that was largely useless until I got one response from South Dakota State University that happened to have this specific document called a predictive model report, which kind of became the foundation of the story, laying out the variables and how heavily weighted they were. And then I went back and asked for aggregate data, broken down by students' race and GPA and gender and their major. And I sent out way more requests than I actually got information back from, and had to fight a couple schools unsuccessfully and successfully to get this. But I ended up getting back a lot more action than I was able to use in the article. I have tables that break this down by multiple variables, including major and GPA and race and gender. The problem is that because of the federal education privacy laws, a lot of it had to be redacted for privacy reasons, and so really just couldn't use it in any kind of conclusive way, which I would have loved to do. I mean, the Markup specialty is doing kind of really good data journalism, and they would have jumped at the chance to do a regression analysis or something and really pinpoint this even more, but we just didn't have the data that we could work with to do that.
Maryclare, should we grab Amy in?
Yes, yeah. I was thinking we could go over to, there's 2 questions in the chat now. Yeah.
Amy, do you want
to? Yeah, sure. So I'm another Master of Information student in Policy and Data Science. You mentioned in the article that there's no evidence really that these systems are effective, but the schools are still buying into them. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about why that's happening if there's no proof that they work.
This is something I see all over the edtech industry, and I think it's becoming even more true during the pandemic, when schools, higher education and K-12 are looking for some kind of solution. And as the article mentions, states have been spending a lot less money on higher education per pupil over the last decade, starting since the Great Recession. And so anytime that somebody says you can spend $100,000 on us and we'll save you $1 million, next year, and the returns will multiply over the years. And EAD in its marketing does this. They say, not just this school improved graduation rates, but as often as not, they'll say this school ended up saving, X amount of money on their recruiting budget because they used our product. So I think that, that's the incentive. Administrators don't know how to validate these tools, and I talked to a couple of experts who study predictive analytics in higher education specifically, and they said we're asking people to do differential impact analyses. We're suggesting it when schools come to us and, want our opinion, but nobody's doing it. Only one study that I'm aware of and that I could find actually tried to do that. That was at Georgia State, which I mentioned earlier, and it hasn't actually been published yet. So I can't say anything about it. But I can't say anything conclusive about it, but in talking to the folks at Georgia State, what they said is that they see it, not having that much of a impact. But again, Georgia State is very different than the other schools that are using this. They don't incorporate race. They spend a ton of money on student advising. They just do a lot of things differently.
If you don't mind, I can also add my perspective on on the end of somebody. Yeah. So my understanding of why we were so excited to use this and what's sort of frustrating about all of this is that it had nothing to do with the risk scores. So it just seems that the risk scores were something that's in the software that we couldn't turn off, that people were like, oh, well, maybe it will help. And I mean, I shouldn't say that because I don't know how these decisions were made. But the reason why we paid so much for it is actually because of sort of more generic tech problems that Navigate promised to solve that it has actually been pretty effective at. So even the simple problem of if I have to meet these 10 students once a year, how do I get them all to sign up for 1 hour long meetings with me without chasing them all around and linking my calendar? And I only have 10, but these advisors have 60. And so I would say 90% of why we use Navigate is because we're just trying to schedule lots of appointments with students in a confidential and easy way. And I bet there's other ways to do that, but that's literally 90% of it. And the other 10%, I think, is they do provide a nice way of tracking meetings. So if a student is being advised and followed along, you can look and see, oh, how did their meetings with their previous advisor go? What was going on there? But that's literally it. And it actually had nothing to do. We introduced this kind of dangerous thing just to get that.
It's like a Trojan horse for racism wrapped in a calendar app or something. Thomas, would you like to ask a curtailed version of your question?
Yeah. As I was typing that, a lot of my things actually got answered. I think, Todd, I think if I could ask a question, it's kind of, so Georgia, you said Georgia State, Georgia Tech, whichever, is already doing this kind of internal, but it's not yet published. But is it possible to do that as someone who's not within the university, to examine these, this kind of metric that they're coming up with, or this algorithm, or is it just so very much behind, closed doors or black boxed?
I don't want to say conclusively because I don't even have the technical expertise to do it if I had the data. But I will say getting the data, I think, is your biggest obstacle for doing this, unless you are just given it by the university with whatever privacy restrictions they want to attach to it. You just can't get non-aggregated, even de-identified data, which some schools will give out in some situations. Was going to be kind of hard because under FERPA, the privacy law here in the US, I think the number is 5. If you have a data category where it's less than 5 students that fit into it, it has to be redacted. And it turns out that there's a lot of majors that are not that big, and GPA brackets, and you add in all these variables, you get less than 5 a lot. That being said, I mean, I would argue as a advocate that these companies should be opening up their algorithms for examination, and even more importantly, schools should not be implementing these without a couple years of study to see what they're doing. And that's hard. Who wants to buy a product, not use it for 2 years or however long, maybe to find out that you wasted your money on it.
Just following along, how difficult is it to understand how these models are working? Do you think that potentially they don't even understand what they've done, possibly?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question for me to answer again, because my level of understanding, well, it's significantly more than it was when I started out. I'm not a data scientist, and even if I had, a very detailed explainer, I would be lost in it. I would be calling a few folks to explain it to me for the article. But I will say, I think the explainability is a big problem, and it doesn't really matter so much whether I can understand it. What matters is how could you explain this in any way that, a advisor with no background in this can understand not just how the model works in general, but why it's delivering a risk score for the particular student who's about to sit in front of them. Yeah, I was talking to the administrator from UW-Milwaukee who described the advising, office at his school as like a doctor's office, where advisors have 15 minutes with each patient, a couple minutes before to prepare, it's on to the next one. And their advising ratio is 700 to 1 in some cases, 700 students to one advisor. And I just don't see from a design perspective how you could even design something that would allow an advisor to understand a risk score in that amount of time, a student. I'm sorry. That is my dog.
That's okay. No worries. What was I going to ask? I got distracted. I forget. Sorry, I just got excited about the dog. I also have a dog, but she's banished.
I try and banish him, but he gets even louder when he's not in the room.
I think, what I wanted to say was that I just think what you were just saying was, it's interesting also just compared to what the staff advisors had to say when I talked to them about this, because they were the first people I went to find out what do I do with this risk score. And they were like, oh, well, we don't even find it useful. Like, we don't know what it means. So we don't, like, the students who actually, because it just tells you red, yellow, or green. It doesn't tell you like, oh, this student's having this problem. So you end up just going to the transcript and stuff anyway.
Yeah, and I certainly heard that from folks at other schools as well. And if that's the case, maybe that's a good thing. At Texas A&M, for example, the first couple of years that they had it, they hadn't even turned on the risk scoring function because they were trying to calibrate it to do it. I forget exactly what the issue was, but they turned it on after a couple of years, and then they just left it there. And nobody got any instruction about how to use it. And so I don't think this is a situation where there are schools, certainly none that I'm aware of, where advisors are, consciously looking at high-risk students and telling all of them to, or encouraging them to switch majors. The question is, what's the first impression you get of a student? And frankly, if even, one advisor, just because they don't understand the score, is encouraging students to pursue a different field of study because of this, it's a problem. And I really didn't talk to anybody except Georgia State, where people are really being educated about how it works and how they should use it.
Liza, did you want to join in?
Sure thing. Hey again, Todd. We met in the breakout room, but for anyone else, I'm Assistant Prof Teach Extreme here at the University of Toronto. And so my question was whether you had some insights or comments on how universities themselves were creating or choosing what goes into the recipe for a risk score, because something you mentioned was that some had race and some didn't, and some things online so just have like a pick your own menu. Thoughts on that or how they're doing it?
Yes, so that's interesting, and actually something that, if I had a little bit more time to work on this in the article, I would have incorporated more, because I really started to find this out like as we were preparing for publication. But EAB had told us that each school chooses which variables go into their risk score. I talked to a couple schools. I mean, Texas A&M in particular is the one that stands out, but UMass as well, where administrators who are the people overseeing these projects for their schools didn't know what the variables were, and we're told in Texas A&M's case that like this is a proprietary algorithm. We can't share it with you, but we'll we'll send you this chart, and this is in the predictive model and threshold reports that says this is how much more accurate your algorithm is than if you were just to base it off of a student's GPA alone. And it looks like it's much more accurate, so why wouldn't you use that? But to the point of picking and choosing, I suspect, but I don't want to say for certain, that this is the kind of thing where, when you're signing up for the service, you get a menu or some kind of report explaining, what's in there. And there's probably a paragraph that says, please let us know if there's anything that you do or don't want to use. And so it takes somebody who's paying really close attention to that to notice that and think about it. But again, that's speculation. I don't know that for sure. I just kind of know how contracts in general come to pass.
I feel like this is sort of the canary in the coal mine a little, though, because it's very easy to see that we start off not really using the risk score. And then maybe it gets baked into how we do things a little bit. And very soon you have to justify if you go against what the risk score is saying. And so we see when we're talking about like AI and stuff, we always say, well, we're just going to have the AI make recommendations. There's always going to be human in the loop, and they're the one making the actual decisions. And we see this in judicial uses of AI. Do you have thoughts around that sort of aspect? Because it becomes hard to say, well, I'm going to overrule this AI when I don't know how it works. It says red, but I think this student should be green, or vice versa. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that frustrates me the most when I talk to any company selling any kind of AI, and really technology in general, especially, I think it's especially true in the education space, where you're over and over again that this is a tool, and we provide a tool that can be helpful, but it's up to the end user to decide how to use it. We provide resources. EAB provides hundreds of hours of training in some cases, they say, to the university, some of it related to bias. But I think one of the most important things that's happening in tech right now in the field of ethical AI is a lot of really smart people who, not by chance, often happen to be people of color, women, people who are queer, are saying that you cannot just put this out into the world and expect people to know how to use it properly. The story actually that I was working on, that when I first heard about the software, is about e-proctoring companies, Proctorio, ProctorU, and that kind of stuff. And again, that's where you hear this explanation all the time that we just flag suspicious behavior, and the professor can go back and look at it and decide whether it's suspicious or not. If the technology that's supposed to be very smart and that you're paying a lot of money for is saying that something's suspicious, and you can't see into a student's room and tell what they were looking at, below there. And I've seen messages that professors have sent to their students that are, really kind of threatening, and scare students. They make them cry, and it's been a really traumatic experience on top of COVID for a lot of students. And the companies are not taking any accountability for that, which is something that I think should really bother universities.
I think this might be a good segue into the last question that I had written down for you, which was like, in this whole process, have you encountered many or any statisticians or computer scientists actually playing an active role in the development and use of these algorithms? And I'm asking because I feel like I've often been struck by this total disconnect between like the academic discourse on this stuff, which is much more nuanced, and would never expect that a company would actually, like, I just feel like it wouldn't be surprising if a company made a risk score based on things that were correlated with race, and we could have a conversation about that. But like in the academic discourse, I don't think you would have ever expected a company would just put race right in there. And so it just feels like there's this gulf. So yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't actually have a good answer to that, because I haven't encountered anybody in particular who's working on it, but that's certainly not to say that they aren't there. I mean, I know that EAB has data scientists and statisticians on their staff, but when I ask them for an interview, those are not the people that I talk to. It's interesting. I should go back and look at EAB and some of the other companies to see who they're working with. There really hasn't been a lot of research, as I mentioned before, peer-reviewed research on this that I was able to find. So I don't think that there are a lot of partnerships in that sense between the industry and academia. But that's something that I should do some more reporting on before I say
Yeah.
weird. Yeah.
Well, I was actually asking also from the perspective of like, I know I perceive in my field a pressure to be less involved in public facing things like this, and more pressure to be involved in like theoretical research on, like the very scientific, or I mean, not that this isn't scientific, but like there's kind of this, I'm also asking because it feels like, especially in university administrations, there's kind of been a pressure for STEM people to stay out of that because that's kind of frivolous work. And for people in other fields, like that's kind of their thing. And I'm just kind of curious. That's why I was thinking of it. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess I just don't really know enough to say
Yeah.
one way or the other.
That's fine. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it sounds like there definitely aren't many statisticians and computer scientists in this sphere or making their voices known in this sphere.
Yeah.
Which could be for a lot of reasons.
And I would say on this one in particular, again, I think it just comes down to, the right people don't necessarily know even what their own universities are using. Or what's out there.
Yeah. Well, another one that you haven't mentioned, but you might want to look into is anytime myself or any of the other assistant professors or professors on this call make a recommendation for someone, you have to fill out these weird surveys now. I've complained about this on Twitter, where you like rank, like this is, by decile, like this student is this percent in like emotional stability and intellectual. And what's hilarious about this humility is I don't think anybody even knows if their university is using them. Like I didn't know that my university was using them when I tweeted about how much I hate them. And then I got asked to write a letter to our own program and I was like, oh. And what Kevin's saying in the chat is true, that like there's a lot of people who will just choose the top category. And when I first heard that, I was like, that's crazy. I'm going to be lying. But I quickly changed my mind to that because I was like, who am I to rate these people? I don't know what these numbers mean. And I'm not going to mess someone up because for all I know, there's some algorithm back there that's, only putting the top people in. But yeah,
So is that through EAB or a different?
No, it seems
software?
to be lots of different companies. I could actually, I don't know any off the top of my head.
We can always chat.
Yeah,
elsewhere.
yeah. But it's been something I've been complaining about mostly just because of the inconvenience. But I do also really worry about it, especially because I think it affects faculty differentially. Like as a young junior woman, when I see a scale, I'm like, oh, I better not lie on the scale. I've got to take this really seriously. And then I find out that like all the senior people who are writing letters, who have assistants, are telling them, oh, have the assistant fill in the top score for everything. Or, Kevin or my friend Albert, he also does the same thing. Now I do that now.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Well, and on top of that, this comes into play a little bit with EAB as well, but regardless of the accuracy, there's a huge kind of privacy concern there. I know that, for EAB, there's some surveys at some institutions where professors are asked to say things like, what are the factors that you think, may be contributing to why the student is or isn't doing well? And in EAB's literature, they say, be careful not to say something like, the student is suffering from depression, or this student, something else going on in their personal life. But if you don't read that as a faculty member, somebody filling this out, you're entering this into a system. EAB has that data, and the university has that data. These things are not always perfectly secure, and even if they are, that kind of stuff should really not be used without a student's consent for even institutional research or internal company research.
I hadn't thought about that, but that is one of the reasons why we really like using it. And I mean, that in our training, we were at least told, like, don't write anything here that you wouldn't be okay with the student seeing, which is always a good way to approach everything. Yeah.
So, Todd, regression is sort of the first step up to, if you think of a scale, we've got AI, and at the other end we've got regression. And Richard McElraith, who is a professor, he teaches Bayesian statistics, he says about regression, so this is about regression, not AI, about regression will not sort it out, because there's this tendency to just throw everything into regression. Regression is an oracle, but it is a cruel one. It speaks in riddles. It delights in punishing us for asking bad questions. And I sort of thought of that when you were talking about how this system works, because it feels like this is just this on steroids. Do you think that maybe we're just is the problem us? Are we just asking the wrong questions?
Yeah, well, I think yes and no, because, you know, it is a good question, I would argue, to ask. And you folks, you know, are in academia and deal with students and professors, so probably know this better than me, but, you know, it is important to be trying to find out why certain students are, you know, struggling, and what we're doing at our institution that might be helping or hurting a specific group of students, whether or not it's based on race or just a factor of, you know, students coming out of high school are not prepared for our, you know, physics 101 course, so we need to adjust the, you know, curriculum there a little bit. But I don't know that, yeah, that this is really an answer to that question in any way. And you know, it's certainly not an answer that gets at the key issues of why students may be struggling. And I think, again, looking back at the Georgia State example, that the thing that really seems to be producing them more success is having more of a human presence in there. And humans are obviously biased in a variety of ways, but a human can find out, you know, if a student is struggling because of their, you know, financial stability, or because they suffered a death in the family. And you can never put death in the family into, you know, as a category into, or at least you shouldn't, maybe somebody will, an algorithm like this. I spoke to one student at UMass who is not in the article, but had said that, you know, when she went into her advisor, who was not a professor there, she was consistently being told that, you know, she should take easier classes and that she should take fewer classes. She was struggling financially and had to take a semester off of college because of that. And she stopped going to her advisor entirely because she just thought that she was hearing the same thing over and over again and wasn't getting any help. She went to her, you know, the dean of students, I think she said, within her program, who sat down and talked with her and ended up, you know, linking her up with another professor who gave her a cheap room to rent in her house. And that's how she ended up graduating college, is because, you know, this person provided her with the resource that she really needed.
Yeah, there was this study. Oh, sorry, Maryclare, do you want to?
Oh, I was just going to say that's a great illustration of, I think, yeah, the importance of students, the importance of advisors and actually having the time to invest in students. And yeah, I feel like all of this is just trying to substitute for that in a way that it could never be.
Yeah, there was a randomized controlled trial ran at Toronto about 5 years ago about academic advising, and could we use bots to do it, or do we need actual humans to do it? And there was no effect from the bots. There was no statistical effect from the bots, and there was a large effect from having humans. So, you know. If anyone has any questions, if they can add it to the chat. But there's always, I feel like you're right doing exactly what I know a lot of students are really interested in doing, and that's sort of using these sorts of data skills. And I know you say that you're not a data person, but I feel like you actually secretly are in the way that you think about things. Using data to sort of like examine what's going on in society and what people are doing that we maybe don't think about. Liza said at the top, like, it just feels like such happenstance that you and Maryclare sort of happen to link up. And if they're interested in this sort of stuff, what sort of advice would you have for them? How did you get into this? How could they follow on your path and get published in the Markup, which is amazing?
Yeah, well, the Markup does some amazing data things. It has actual data scientists who are working there. And so I'm sure that they would be interested in working on stories. I would say the thing that the most important tool that I have as a journalist for stories like this is familiarizing myself with the public records process. At the Markup, actually, we did a Twitch stream talk about public records and kind of how they were incorporated into the story, how the story was built on them. And I put together a one-pager that you can find on their website that has, you know, the basics for public record strategies. And it's catered more towards student journalists, so it might not be the exact kind of thing that you know, folks in your program would want. But I mean, my philosophy is that if it's a public institution, the data belongs to the public, and you should always ask for it. And it might take a long time, and it might be, you know, tricky to get. In some cases, you might have to bring on a lawyer if you really, really want it, and they won't give it to you. But it's worth asking for aggregate data, de-identified data. You know, see, maybe universities are going to be more willing to give it to, you know, folks, you know, within their own institution, especially if it's for research purposes. I would hope that they are, although they could also give it to me as a journalist. I'm very responsible. I don't use it well. But yeah, I'm also happy to answer any questions off of this. Like I said before, you know, public records are really my passion, and I love talking about it. So if anybody wants to try and submit a request, you know, needs help with language or just the general mechanics of it, I'm happy to connect and talk about that.
I just think that's very cool. I hope to learn about that someday, but I fear that I will get in trouble if I FOIA my own university, so I won't do it. I need to wait until I have another target.
So to that end, I would also highly recommend this Muckrock, which is a website, but it's a nonprofit whose entire goal is to facilitate the public records request process. And you can sign up as an anonymous user through it and submit requests anonymously. And almost all their requests are public also, so you can go and research the other things that folks have asked for from your institution or other institutions. All my requests for this article are on Muckrock, and you can even hit a button there that just says clone, and it will submit the exact same request to another, you know, institution of your choice.
That's really cool. It would be so fun to teach students to do that.
Yeah.
We could start a secret club, Maryclare. And when when you get tenure, we could, you know, then out ourselves as the people that were doing this, all these secret FOIs.
Yeah.
I would actually also be really interested to learn what the process is like in Canada. I just haven't, for, you know, any particular story, done that yet, but I should be, because I know that these, you know, kinds of tools are being used at Canadian universities as well.
Yeah, we had a really interesting guest, Tom Cardoso from the Globe and Mail, who does FOI requests in Canada. And he FOI'd requests around sentencing in prisons and that sort of thing. They gave him individual level data for prisoners. And so we ended up with about 75,000 observations, each of these being a prisoner. And then he analyzed them to find that folks who are different races, but all else being, you know, as equal as we can make it, do tend to be treated differently. There's a small number of people doing this sort of stuff, but he was so keen, exactly like Maryclare was sort of saying, he was so keen to unleash the power of the students to make requests.
And then once all the students have the data and have done the work, they can just contact me and I'll write a story about it. And that's how I make my money.
I'm actually sort of interested in that aspect, because you have like a fine line of like trying to satisfy, Maryclare in terms of like, well, this needs to be statistically appropriate, but at the same time trying to appeal to a general audience. The markup may be slightly nerdy, but it's still the public. How do you sort of toe that when you're writing? Do you have any thoughts or tips around that?
I always find that, one or two compelling numbers, can tell a story as well. Well, not always, but sometimes can tell a story as well as a lot of numbers. Also, just as a journalist, it's always helpful to have, a narrative based around people in there to be able to show, how this affects a specific person. Unfortunately fortunately for this, I wasn't able to find, a student who knew that they had been redirected from, one major to another because of their risk score. But that there are many stories about students, being affected by the proctoring software, for example, or these other kinds of ed tech tools that universities are using. And then also, we use the Markup and I use a service called, oh my God, I can't remember the name, but it's stats.org, where, I give my data to a statistician who looks it over, talks through it with me, and it's all confidential, so I don't have to worry about, somebody else getting my story, and then talks about ways to, present it accurately and effectively.
Yeah, so for folks that don't know, this is a service that connects journalists, if I'm correct, with statistics professors essentially, and they volunteer their time to try and improve the stats of journal articles. So it's a great service. I think it might be US based, maybe North American based.
I know that the person I talked to was George Washington University, I believe, here in the States.
It does look like it's Virginia based. I've never heard of it. That's so cool. I just didn't know.
Does anyone else have any other comments or questions for Todd while we have him? A, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. So I'm another Master of Information student at Toronto, and this is more like of a journalism noob question, but how does a story like this get made? Like, I feel like it's one thing to like foil the records, or even like write your own narrative that you tell your friends at the bar, but it's a whole different thing to get this story actually published.
Well, so first of all, I've been a journalist for about, a professional working journalist for 6-7 years now. I had been freelancing for a little over a year, and I'm still figuring that part out. A lot of it comes down to, hooking up with the right organization. In this case, the Markup, they really do these data-centric stories, these, tech accountability stories. The perfect venue for this. And I work with a lot of smart editors who take my, this was, I think, like 3,500 words, my first draft, and, condensed it down into something like that. But, it's really just talking to a bunch of people, gathering opinions, writing stuff down, reading it, figuring out where there are gaps, where you have questions about what you've written, finding somebody else to talk to. Just a lot of phone and Zoom calls. I don't know if that answered the question at all.
No, it does. I've only ever known like people who like left WNYC because they couldn't find the support. So hearing how it actually happens helps. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like we have artists in residence, right? I feel like we need a journalist in residence at the stats department or the faculty of information.
That'd be cool. Before we wrap up, I feel obliged to mention that UMass, since the publication of your story, is no longer showing the risk scores. They found how to turn them off. At least
really?
they're not showing them in the places where they've been able to figure out how to turn it off. So I feel obliged to say that, since I know that a lot of the people involved are doing wonderful work for students and didn't realize this was happening, and are glad they know now, and that they can turn it off. So.
Well, UMass in particular is one of the schools where the administrators I talked to were genuinely like interested in having the conversation once they knew what it was about.
Yeah, totally.
Well, we might just say thank you once again to Todd for joining us. I know you've got a lot on, so thank you. Really appreciate your time, and very much looking forward to what you publish next. I can't imagine.
Well, thank you all, and just my journalistic plug at the end. If you ever have anything that you think is worth looking into and could use some more attention, please let me know. I've got a website that's just my name, has my contact information there. But yeah, pitches and tips are most welcome.
Thank you. Same thing as Rohan said. That's just really interesting.